what's the current state of how do they handle vulnerability disclosure?
So with Apple, both on iOS and OS X, and I guess any other software that they make, they have a website with contact information for their security team. They have like PGP keys you can use to encrypt that information. If you're a researcher, definitely want to encrypt anything you send to these companies because you don't want anyone else to be looking at that. But once you send that information to Apple, you disclose that to Apple, it can be a little opaque because they'll receive that. Definitely someone receives that, and then they will decide what they're going to do with it, and they might contact you again, assign a CVE number to that vulnerability so it can be tracked in the future. But that's all, you send them an email, they will reply. It's not, a super well defined process necessarily, so they do receive it, but then what happens in the background, I don't work at Apple, so I can really tell you exactly what happens. You can contact them, and then they'll usually contact you back and eventually credit you for a vulnerability once it gets fixed.
All right, but yeah, as we know, a lot of companies these days are doing a little bit more than this. And not to criticize Apple, but how is the best company in the whole industry, how are they handling disclosure?
So many companies use things like, for example, bug bounties, where not only will they offer money or other types of rewards to researchers in exchange for vulnerabilities, but they also have a more complete framework around or a complete system around receiving vulnerabilities, informing the researcher about what's happening with that vulnerability and status, and then in the end, once that is fixed, can you publicly disclose that? When can you publicly disclose that? And if it's a bug bounty, obviously at some point the reward gets exchanged. So one of the advantages of doing a bug bounty, depending on what kind of company you are, is it can make it interesting to security researchers to look at your issues. But you have to remember that depending on the type of bug bounty you're running, you might receive a lot of information, which is good, but that's a lot of stuff that you need to sort through. So many companies do use that and seem to be successful with it.
It seems to be a fair way to, when you're crowdsourcing, fixing your bugs to keep your clients safe, to at least reward the people finding them and reporting them to you somewhat for doing so.
And mostly you're going to attract more people by doing that, right? So if you're a company, it's really about making sure that people feel comfortable to report something to you, but also making sure that there are some rules. So for example, if you make a consumer device, and someone buys it and finds a vulnerability and reports it to you, it's really local to your own device. So there's no chance of them accessing like other client data or anything like that. But when you have a cloud service, for example, you really want the rules to be clear on what can be tested and what's off limits, right? Because you don't necessarily want people to use that as an excuse to try and get all of that data. So really, depending on the type of company you are and depending on what you want to get people to report vulnerabilities on. When you have a bug bounty, you can make it clear. You can also make it clear depending on your process, but it's important to remember, to really focus on what you want to protect and where people should look for issues.
All right, so there are certain things you can do that companies like Apple are not currently doing. Would you say it's safe to assume that Apple know that these options exist?
Well, Apple has a great security team. I'm sure they are aware that it exists, but as I said, there's situations where they make a lot of sense. There's some other situations where it might not necessarily be the best option. So I'm sure that internally they've looked at it, and if they haven't done it yet, either there's a reason why they haven't, or maybe they will do it in the future. Only Apple could tell.
Have you found vulnerabilities in iOS or OS X or other Apple products and reported them to Apple? And if yes, how did that go?
Yeah, so in fact I did in iOS. It was an issue with how FaceTime Audio handles URL schemes. So you could get a web page to automatically redirect you to FaceTime and place a call automatically, which would be a privacy issue if because that reveals your caller ID or your either your phone number or your iCloud email account that's linked to FaceTime. So I did report that. After maybe a few weeks, they acknowledged they've received it. They replied to me. Then they confirmed that it was a security issue and that they were working on it. And then when iOS 7 or 7.1 was released, whichever one had the fix in it, they always release a page called Security Contents of iOS 7.x or iOS 8.x with all the vulnerabilities that are fixed. So that's really often where you'll see all the vulnerabilities used for jailbreaks. They're listed in there, and they credit whoever reported that vulnerability. In fact, if you see all the jailbreak jailbreak vulnerabilities are quite often credited to the jailbreak group, so there's the name of the group, and they credit you there, and they just email you to let you know that they've taken care of that.
Right, so you got some kind of professional satisfaction, recognition for finding it, but you didn't get paid. If we look at it from an Apple perspective, a lot of Apple clients were, by you doing this, were protected from potential identity theft, which could have caused monetary loss and so on. So the cascading effects of that bug have still been significant.
Well, it was a pretty bad issue. That's why they fixed it, And I didn't need to be paid for it. I thought it was interesting, and we do research for all kinds of reasons. Of course, if they were paying people, maybe they would attract more researchers. But there's still plenty of people working on that. And in fact, look at the jailbreak community. Sometimes there's a financial reward that is somewhere else, and that's something you need to fight against if you're doing a bug bounty. And you cannot pay people more than some of these other options sometimes. So you always have to balance, what is going to bring the best results to your security program for your product, knowing that you can never pay as much as some other options that some people have when they find, especially remote code execution vulnerabilities and all that.
I think that was a good wrap-up. Let's finish that. Thank you very much, Guillaume.